All right, ready for art and beauty? Well, it will be disappointing in the sense that it's also going to be about dysfunctionality and death, of course, as almost always with Lacan. For Freud, talking about art means indeed talking about sublimation, and sublimation is something unavoidable, but it's also something valuable. It produces absolutely relevant products for us as social human beings. Yeah? So Freud cherishes art. He says, yes, it still is sublimation. That means what we really want, namely a good hard fuck, we don't get. We get a replacement product. But that is not without value. Quite the opposite. Yeah? We're trading something in, obviously something gets lost in this process, but we are also achieving something. And a lot of what we achieve, Freud is very fond of himself. Yeah? He has a very strong connection to the arts. As you know, he collects Egyptian and Greek and Roman statuettes and has them in his office. So that is very, very important for him. And when he has to leave Vienna due to the Nazi occupation, he makes sure that all of these statuettes get packed up in trunks and trunks that get shipped over to ultimately London via Paris. So they're enormously important to him and were throughout his entire life. And he sees in beauty, indeed, I'll talk about that in a second, he sees there something quite relevant. Lacan also, as you might recall from my very first lecture when I introduced his biography, is very, very fond of the arts and lived in close proximity to artists all throughout his life, from his youth, from his teenage years, until he died, being personal friends with the surrealists, witnessing James Joyce read from Ulysses the very first time in Paris, being the private physician of Picasso, and basically hanging out with French artists and international artists in Paris all throughout his life. He himself collected art. He owned some very, very important, very expensive paintings. The most important one, probably Gustave Courbet, L'origine du monde. Do you know the painting? It's just a close-up of a vagina, and Lacan had it in his country home, and it was behind a movable panel with someone else's work in front, and then oftentimes at dinner parties, it was a little, in a way, a little prudish almost. He would then have that front panel removed, and then all of a sudden, you would gaze at this 19th century painting of a vagina. I don't even know. I think it's back in the Louvre now. Is it the d'Orsay? Okay, so it's they bought it back at the Musée d'Orsay were some very other important Courbet paintings also reside. So he collected contemporary paintings as well, not just 19th century paintings like that. He was a regular visitor to musical events in the 1950s and 1960s, especially contemporary classical experimental music in the 1950s or 1960s. He never said anything clever about music. They're just... and strangely enough, there is not a whole lot of good material on music written by psychoanalysts, period. Freud himself admitted he doesn't get music. It was weird for him. And Lacan listened to it, but didn't have anything to say about it. One attempt was made by a student of Lacan, Julia Kristeva, who wrote a book in the 1970s, The Revolution of Poetic Language, in which she tried to pick up again with Melanie Klein and go back to the period before the Oedipal conflict, go back very, very far into childhood, and she postulates a stage that she calls chora, with a Greek word that she takes from Plato. And chora is a state of undifferentiated existence where all that basically occurs is pulsation, is rhythm, which then becomes very important in language as the meter, yeah. But from there on, you could also, of course, move toward musical rhythm, especially with the development that music took coming out of jazz, but especially after the 60s, where rhythm liberated itself from melody and forms of music came into existence that basically are pure rhythm. And when we go to Berghain or Kit Kat Club now, of course what we dance to is music that is pure rhythm, right? There is no element that's not rhythmic. Yeah? In other words, melody. That has been, eliminated to 95% also. We have to watch the Eurovision Song Contest to have a throwback to those times. So for Freud, art is sublimation. And I said sublimation means rechanneling of sexual energy, libido, into something that is culturally acceptable. That doesn't have to be art. It can be science. It can be applied science, so any kind of practical engineering, even just any kind of creation or construction, building a house, building a garage, building a bike. Those are forms of sublimation as well. In other words, every cultural product that we know is the result of sublimation. Culture is sublimation. Otherwise, we'd still be animals. Everything that we create as artifacts is sublimation, rechanneling of libido. What does the artist get? The artist gets a certain amount of recognition. Where that comes from, we'll see in a moment. It also might be, on the side of the artist, an incapacity to completely leave behind certain modes of childish behavior. Freud, in a way, doesn't quite trust the artist. He thinks artists are strange types who haven't fully matured. They're in a way stuck somewhere between childhood and proper adulthood. Yeah, and that is what allows them to create works of art. The question is, for Freud, why do we care about works of art? Why do we read novels? Why do we read poems? Why do we look at paintings or movies? Why do we listen to music? What is it that makes us want to engage with these products? And one answer that Freud gives is as follows. As children, we spend a lot of time living with our fantasies. And as we grow up, we learn that these fantasies are flights from reality. Yeah? Those are daydreams. And we learn that in order to be successful in our everyday life, we need to focus a lot on the reality around us. Learning things in school, getting an education, going to work, organizing on which days we do our shopping and on which days we do our laundry. So engaging productively with the outside world, handling the people around us. And what we learn is not to spend too much time in our fantasy world. We don't give it up entirely. We still have a fantasy life, right? Even as adults. Freud says it's basically pretty primitive, the fantasy life that we have. It has two contents. What are they? We fantasize about two things only.
Sex and money.
Yeah, or money standing in for power or any kind of success, yeah, anything that glorifies our ego. Success, admiration, being promoted at work, being elected president of the United States, yeah, whatever it is, something where we play an outstanding role, where we are important, where people look up to us. That is one thing that we fantasize about. And you know, it can also just be sorting out our lives, being rich, all of that. And the other is sex, right? So we have erotic daydreams and we have daydreams of narcissistic grandeur, of as he calls it, the majesty, the ego, where we fantasize ourselves particularly powerful, successful. Given the nature of this, do you expect that we freely share our fantasy life with others? Probably not, except for some kinky moments where we might, you know, talk to our lovers about having fantasized about them, you know, this morning while we were at work typing an email to some client, and you know, that kind of admission then becomes arousing and becomes titillating. Yeah, I've just fantasized about you, but usually our daydreams of success and of erotic conquests are a little embarrassing to us. So we keep them to ourselves. In fact, it's discouraged usually to talk about them. Yeah, when you start you know, sharing fantasies of grandeur, quite often your surroundings, you know, oftentimes your parents as you grow up will say, that's well and good, but you know, don't go around telling people that you're going to be the next chancellor, or that, you know, you're going to be a multimillionaire. You can dream about that, right? Dream about it, but you know, once you've made your first million, that's fine, but until then, keep it to yourself, right? Don't go around telling everyone that. So we learn not to share, and with erotic dreams even more so. Our neighbors just don't want to be bothered, and we also make that clear usually that we don't want to hear your stories. Thank you. So the poet, the novelist, now is someone who says, I don't accept that I'm not supposed to talk about these things. I will talk about them. So he doesn't quite grow up. He doesn't quite enter adulthood. He says, I'm going to somehow disregard these rules of being responsible, being private. I'm going to make it public. I will continue to tell everyone. However, if you do it in a very straightforward manner, just talking about your fantasies of grandeur and your erotic fantasies, it's going to be some more or less, and probably very much on the less side, diary of an eternally pubescent half-wit. What's missing in order to turn this into something that will interest us and that we'd eventually be willing to call, you know, a special product, or what we do, of course, is call it art. Yeah, it's just a label we will eventually attach to it. Something is missing. What do we still need in order to care about the more or less private fantasies of someone?
To be codified?
Yeah, or there needs to be some kind of form that we find attractive. Yeah. In other words, the content is one side, but somehow the artist needs to find a form, a story, or a poetic meter, you know, writing it as a sonnet, writing it as an elegy. We must be interested in the form in order to then care about the content. So beauty is basically, just for Freud, it's just our excuse to continuously deal with these fantasies. Yeah? It's just an excuse. And he speaks at one point of time, for example, about Verlockungsprämie. So there is something seductive in beauty. Yeah, it's seductive in itself, so that we're willing then to face these erotic fantasies. And we need beauty in order to do that, so that we don't feel guilty. If we engage too much with fantasy life, without this aspect of beautiful form, we will feel guilty. We will feel as if we somehow have fallen back onto a stage that we should have left behind. Yeah, we're not being responsible adults here. But if it's beautifully wrapped, we can accept it. And still, for Freud, there seems to be an aspect of regression or of stagnation in all of this, right? We're falling back onto stages that are a little suspect. Let me give you Lacan's version, and because he differs. Ultimately I'm closer to Lacan than to Freud. So Lacan also is very fascinated by art, and I'll give you his version of not so much literature, but visual art, painting mostly. And that harks back, of course, to what I have told you about the imaginary as one of the three registers. Images, Lacan argues, capture us. They have a power to capture us. That is something that becomes very important, for example, for theoreticians of film, who argue that the film sutures you in. And there's a whole school of Lacanian film theory that was developed mostly in the 1980s in the United States, mostly, sometime to some extent Britain. People like Laura Mulvey and I'm blinking on other names. They'll come to me later. I don't like them, you can tell. Lacan says the gaze, when we are being looked at, that is always threatening for us. Being looked at, there's always an aspect of what primitive cultures describe as the evil eye. It's very powerful. You get looked at and you feel confused or even massively threatened. Why is that? Why do we experience the gaze of someone as something so powerful and ultimately so negative?
Tension and revelation.
Yeah, it has to do with that. Lacan argues that at the very least, the gaze of the other is destabilizing for us, because when the other looks at us, we wonder, what does he want from us? What's his desire? Why are we being looked at? And we try to figure that out. And that destabilizes our own position, right? What am I in the eye of the other? What is his or her desire? And that is on a more basic level as any concrete sexual desire, right? Like, am I being stared at because I'm being turned into a sexual object? Yeah. It's on a more basic level, and it doesn't have to do with gender or a very fixed sexual position. But the gaze of the other for us is always, at least to some extent, enigmatic. We don't know why the other person looks at us. And we keep wondering. There never is an answer. With our lovers and spouses, even their desire remains enigmatic to us as well. And we continue to wonder, why do they look at us the way they look? And oftentimes we ask, why do you look at me like that? We also like to go to museums with our lovers. Have you noticed? Do you like doing that? Because we like talking about the desire of the other. What do you see in that? When you look at that, what do you see? It's important to us to somehow figure that out. This desire, however, can also be not just a curiosity, but it can be quite monstrous and it can be quite threatening. It can overwhelm us completely. It can devour us. it can be traumatic, yeah, this gaze that we experience. And what do we do when we encounter a gaze that is, from our perspective, very, very powerful and very, very threatening? What are our options? What would be logical to do, or what you know, huh? To run. We could, of course, escape the gaze, right? Somehow get away from the gaze. Let's assume that is not possible. We've tried that strategy, you know, getting away from the gaze of the other doesn't work. We're always being seen. By the way, any of you who have had a little bit of Lacanian training and then 2 weeks ago wandered around the city when the Kirchentag took place under the motto, "Du siehst mich," and there was just this pair of eyes, I couldn't help thinking, this is not comforting. Yeah. But I thought, you know, someone who's unconscious needs to be checked out a little more carefully, designed this motto and these posters. So we can't run. What do we do?
Usually you either look until the other person looks away, or you look away yourself.
Yeah, you can try to stare the other person down and see what happens. That of course is possibly dangerous, especially if the other is considered to be very powerful, right? Imagine yourself to be an infant and dealing with the gaze of your mother or your father. You know, you staring them down might not be an option yet for you.
Try to please it in terms of like how you imagine it, what would it like maybe.
Yeah, you could mold yourself. I mean, that is what we constantly try to do, indeed. We try to figure out, how does the other person see us? And a lot of how we see ourselves has to do with the way someone else has seen us before. What are your favorite body parts of yourself? Do you have one? Everyone has one, right? Can you think of them? Very quickly, think of your favorite body parts on your own body. Why are they your favorite body parts? Because I bet in almost all cases, because someone said, you really have the cutest nose in the world. Or your mother said, your golden hair looks so beautiful in the sunshine. Or, you know, I love how your ass feels. Yeah, someone said, this is how your body looks to me. And in almost all cases, you adopt that. So our self-image very, very much depends on how others have seen us in the past and have communicated that to us. There's one strategy that you haven't tried out yet, namely to divert the gaze. Make them look elsewhere, right? Don't look at me, look here. And how do we achieve this here? well, we have to put something there that will attract the gaze. And Lacan says that's what the artist does. The artist creates, the visual artist creates a work in order to distract the gaze of the other. So basically to put up a shield behind which he or she can then hide. Look at that thing. Isn't it pretty? Don't look at me. Yeah? So diverting the gaze. In a way, it is a very, very ancient strategy. The Greeks have a word for it. Does anyone know it? It's called apotropeion, a almost magic shield against the evil eye. Yeah? And various objects can be used to achieve that in Greek culture. And almost all, quote unquote, the Greek culture is not a primitive culture, but an ancient culture. And so in most ancient cultures, something like this exists. And obviously, if we follow Lacan in our culture, still. So what the artist does is he or she uses beauty to create a barrier behind which he can hide. And on the other side of this barrier is what is threatening, what is destructive, and ultimately for Lacan, what points toward death. Yeah, the ultimate threat, death. So beauty is a shield that we use in order to keep death at bay. Let me briefly talk about how Lacan sees sublimation. And that will add another aspect to this aesthetic theory. He goes back to notions that Melanie Klein had developed. Notions about infancy, very early infancy, were, for the infant, the relationship to the mother's body is always at least frustrating, oftentimes traumatizing, because it alternates between suffocating proximity. When the mother is there, she is too much there. She takes up all breathing space. She's overwhelming. And painful, unaccountable absence. When the mother is gone, there's no guaranteed way to bring her back. It means suffering, it means hunger, it means existential insecurity. So the infant goes back and forth between suffering from overwhelming closeness and suffering from inexplicable absence. And this too much presence, too much absence, cannot be represented. There is no way to find symbolic expression for this. So at the very beginning of the infant's experience is this gap. There is a hole. There is something that cannot be put into words or symbolized or somehow come to terms with. And Lacan calls this this gap, this hole that structures our existence so much, the thing. And he uses a Freudian term, das Ding. It is something like our very first inkling, our very first experience of death. Yeah, to which no meaning can be ascribed, that we encounter as shattering, as insufferable. And somehow we still need to come to terms with this, right? It is so enormously overwhelming. We need to address it. And that is for Lacan the motivation to create art. Art basically circles around this hole, circles around this gap, and tries to create objects that can fill it. And yet, of course, they always fail. This early experience of death and destruction cannot be eliminated. It cannot be shut out by some pretty artwork. But we keep trying to put artworks in the place of this gap, in the place of this hole. Most clearly, that comes to the fore in our fascination, of course, with artworks that actually contain elements of horror and of destruction or of absence. And for Lacan, sublimation means nothing other than this process of continuously creating new objects with which we try to fill this gap. Yeah? That is for him sublimation. This gap, of course, remains. And it might be that which Kant and subsequently the Romantic philosophers described as the infinite interpretability of a work of art. That you never get to the point where you can say, we now understood the artwork, we now know what it means, we don't have to talk about it anymore. If it's a work of art, we will continue to have questions and we can say clever things about it, but a year later or 10 years later, someone else will find something clever to say about it that we hadn't noticed before. But to reiterate, the motivation for all of this is the encounter with death and destruction. So for Freud, the motivation was to somehow stay in touch with our fantasy life. Lacan says, no, we create art because we've come too close to death and destruction when we were way too young. And art is our lifelong attempt to somehow keep that at bay, to somehow come to terms with that, make it bearable, make it a little more livable for us. But it will fail. Yeah, it will fail. Let me stop there.